The envelope was a ghost. It lay on the worn welcome mat of Camila Santos's third-floor walk-up, a stark, pearlescent rectangle against the scuffed linoleum, and its presence felt like a violation, a specter from a life she had fought tooth and nail to bury. The handwriting on its face was a blade against her memory, the sharp, arrogant slant of Richard Thompson's calligraphy, a script she had once found distinguished, a script that now seemed to mock the very air she breathed. It had arrived on a Thursday, a day already thick with the oppressive August humidity that clung to the city like a fever, and its arrival turned the heat from a nuisance into a suffocating threat. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her grocery bags digging into the flesh of her forearm, the condensation from a carton of milk beginning to dampen the brown paper, her heart a steady, reliable drum that had powered her through stakeouts, deadlines, and the crushing loneliness of the past 3 years began a frantic, stuttering rhythm against her ribs. He wouldn't, he couldn't, but the very existence of the envelope confirmed that he could, and he would. Richard's cruelty had never been the loud, explosive kind. It was a quiet, meticulous poison, administered in carefully measured doses designed for maximum psychological damage. With a deep, fortifying breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, she nudged the door shut with her hip, dropped her groceries onto the small kitchen counter, and picked up the letter. The cardstock was thick, expensive, impossibly smooth beneath her fingertips, the kind of detail Richard worshipped, a tactile symbol of his ascent into a world from which he had so surgically excised her. She slit the seal with her thumbnail, the tearing sound unnervingly loud in the quiet of her apartment. Inside, the invitation was everything she expected and dreaded. Engraved silver lettering on the same pearlescent paper announced the holy matrimony of Richard Alistair Thompson and Madison Victoria Clark. The venue was the Oakwood Grand Country Club, a place Camila had only read about in society columns, a bastion of old money and exclusionary politics. The date was a mere 3 weeks away. It was a statement, a meticulously crafted tableau of everything he had become, and by extension, everything she was not. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom, scrawled in the same familiar ink, that made her blood turn to ice. Camila, I thought you might like to see how a real wedding is done. I hope you'll attend. It will be instructive. The word hung in the air, venomous and precise. It was a scalpel, designed to reopen old wounds with clinical precision. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a summons to her own humiliation. A command performance where she was cast in the role of the tragic, discarded first wife. He wanted her there as a prop, a living testament to his magnanimity and her failure. He wanted her to witness his definitive triumph, his union with a woman who was his perfect counterpart, a blonde, blue-eyed lawyer, the pedigreed daughter of a federal judge, a woman who belonged in his world without explanation or apology. Camila Santos was 32 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years rebuilding her life from the ashes of her marriage, a marriage that had combusted not with a fiery argument, but with a quiet, chilling pronouncement from Richard over a dinner of Chilean sea bass he'd complained was overcooked. It's just not working anymore. Camila, he had said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. We're from different worlds. I can't keep translating you to my colleagues, translating you as if she were a foreign text he'd grown tired of deciphering for his friends at the prestigious law firm of Sterling, Croft and Lowell, as if her existence, her very being, was an inconvenience to his curated life. The separation that followed had been a masterclass in social annihilation. One by one their mutual friends had faded away, their calls becoming less frequent, their excuses for not meeting up more elaborate. Richard had orchestrated it all with the same strategic brilliance he applied to his legal cases, poisoning the well with carefully chosen whispers about irreconcilable differences in background, a polite, bloodless euphemism for the truth. He had grown ashamed of his black wife from the suburbs. He was tired of the subtle, surprised lift of an eyebrow when he introduced her at Firm Gallus, tired of explaining that yes, she was a journalist, but for a small neighborhood paper, not exactly the Times. He had wanted a wife who was an accessory, a seamless extension of his own ambition. Camila, with her sharp mind, her fierce opinions, and her skin color, was a complication he no longer had the patience to manage. 3 years had passed since that final, devastating conversation. 3 years of clawing her way back from the brink. And now, holding this monument to his malice in her hands, a slow, dangerous smile spread across Camila's lips. It was a smile her few remaining enemies had learned to fear, a smile that promised not tears or retreat, but a reckoning. Richard Thompson, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had no earthly idea who she had become. He still pictured her as the woman he'd left, a broken, weeping mess, writing fluff pieces about local politics for a paper that lined Bird. For the first 6 months, he wouldn't have been wrong. She had moved into this tiny apartment, put her career on autopilot, and wrapped herself in a cocoon of grief and solitude, avoiding any social gathering where she might catch a glimpse of his new, improved life. The world he inhabited, a world of rooftop cocktail parties and charity auctions, had become a minefield. But then came the call, an unexpected offer from David Mendes, the grizzled, no-nonsense editor-in-chief of the Metropolitan Chronicle, a citywide paper with a reputation for scrappy, fearless reporting. He'd seen one of her pieces, a surprisingly incisive article on zoning variances, and had a feeling about her. He offered her a freelance assignment, investigate a burgeoning scandal involving irregularities in municipal bids for public works projects. It was a dry, complex story, the kind most reporters avoided. Camilla, with nothing to lose and a deep, simmering need to pour her rage into something constructive, took it. She had plunged into the work with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The investigation became her obsession. She spent weeks buried in public records, deciphering labyrinthine contracts, and cultivating sources in the city's bureaucracy. The article she finally produced was a bombshell. It was more than just good journalism. It was a masterpiece of forensic reporting, connecting a network of shell companies and backroom deals to the mayor's closest aides. The story didn't just win her a full-time position at the Chronicle, it won national awards, caught the attention of major media outlets, and, most importantly, forged her new identity. That in the 2 years that followed, Camila Santos had transformed. The heartbroken woman was gone, replaced by one of the most respected and feared investigative journalists in the country. Her name opened doors that Richard, with all his money and connections, couldn't wedge open with a crowbar. What he certainly didn't know was that in the process of unearthing civic corruption, she had built an astonishingly loyal network of contacts, cops on the beat, clerks in the courthouse, jaded bureaucrats in regulatory agencies, people who saw in her a genuine crusader for the truth, someone who valued their story and protected her sources. They respected her, and in return they talked to her, and sometimes they shared the most interesting information. Whispers about certain high-flying corporate lawyers who had a golden touch with public contracts. Lawyers who navigated the city's bidding process with a little too much ease. Lawyers who used questionable methods and influential friends to secure lucrative deals for their clients. Lawyers like Richard Alistair Thompson. Camila folded the invitation with surgical precision and placed it on the small wooden table in her living room. It looked obscene there, next to a stack of files overflowing with bank statements and incorporation documents. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face, her eyes glittering with the dangerous, predatory intensity she always got. When she was closing in on a big story, she began to type an email to David Mendes, subject special assignment, available for event coverage this Saturday, 3 weeks. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, the plan began to crystallize in her mind, elegant and brutal in its simplicity. Richard wanted her to come to his wedding to feel small, to be a ghost at his feast. He wanted to instruct her on how a real life, a successful life, was lived. But what he failed to realize was that he was no longer the protagonist of this story. He was about to become the headline of the biggest investigation of her career, an exposé she had been meticulously preparing for the past 18 months. The last few months of their marriage had been a slow, agonizing tutorial in the art of calculated humiliation. Richard had become a master of the subtle wound, the public slight disguised as a joke. At a partner's Christmas party, he had introduced her to a judge by saying, "This is my wife, Camila. She's a journalist, so be careful what you say around her," his tone infusing the word journalist with the same weight as plumber or dog walker, for his audience a way of signaling that she was not one of them. When a colleague, having actually read her work, complimented a piece she'd written, Richard would quickly steer the conversation away, making a glib remark about the tabloid press and its hunger for ratings, lumping her earnest local reporting in with celebrity gossip. The final, unforgivable straw had been at the Lawyers Association annual gala. It was the night she realized her marriage was not just failing, it was a complete fiction. She had been standing alone at the bar, nursing a club soda, when Richard approached with Madison Clark on his arm. He didn't see her, or rather, he performed the act of not seeing her, a feat of social acrobatics that was both breathtaking and devastating. He stood mere feet away, his back angled just so, creating an invisible wall between them, and Camilla heard every crystalline word of his conversation with Madison. It's refreshing to talk to a woman who actually understands the business world, Richard had said, his voice a low, intimate purr. Someone who gets the nuances. Madison had laughed, a light musical sound. Well, some people just aren't cut out for certain environments, Richard. It takes a certain background. Some people just aren't cut out for certain environments. The words had struck Camilla with the force of a physical blow. She had slipped out of the party, hailed a cab in her ridiculously expensive gown that Richard had insisted she buy, and cried for the entire ride home, the tears tracking mascara down her face. He had arrived hours later, feigning surprise that she had left without him. Now, 3 years later, rereading his malicious, instructive note, she felt not a single tear. The feeling of invisibility he had so carefully cultivated around her had been replaced by a white-hot sense of purpose. He had perfected the art of making her feel inadequate without ever having to say the words, without ever having to admit that the core of his shame was her race, her class, her refusal to be a silent, smiling accessory. Her gaze swept across her desk, a chaotic but organized landscape of her current investigation. Stacks of files, highlighted documents, a corkboard covered in a web of names and arrows, all connected to a single, central photograph of Richard Thompson, smiling confidently at a charity fundraiser. For the last 18 months, this investigation had been her life. It had started with a tip from her network, a courthouse clerk who had noticed a pattern. Same judge, same lawyer, same 3 construction companies winning all the big city contracts. The clerk had told her over coffee, "Smells funny, Camilla, smells like a Thompson special." That tip had unraveled a scheme of breathtaking arrogance. Richard Thompson was not just a successful lawyer. He was the architect of a sophisticated bid-rigging conspiracy that involved at least 3 major construction firms and 2 city councilmen who sat on the appropriations committee. The irony was its own form of poetry. Richard, the man obsessed with appearances and propriety, believed he was the epitome of discretion. His clandestine meetings in the private rooms of expensive steakhouses, the contracts signed in the cigar lounges of exclusive clubs, the intricate dance of money moved through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. He thought he was untouchable, a ghost in the machine. He had no idea that every move was being meticulously documented by a team of investigators who didn't even know they were working for him. Feeding information to the ex-wife he thought was penning articles about bake sales. When Camilla had first brought the investigation to David Mendez, he had been skeptical. He sat across from her in his glass-walled office, his expression a mask of journalistic caution. "Camilla, I know the history here," he'd said, steepling his fingers. "We have to be absolutely certain this isn't personal. Our credibility is on the line." In response, Camilla had calmly unpacked a briefcase onto his large oak desk. She laid out photographs taken with a long-lens camera, bank statements obtained through a source in international finance, and finally a small digital audio recorder. "David," she had said, her voice steady and clear, "when a man steals millions of dollars in public funds over a period of 3 years, money that was earmarked for schools and public housing, and uses that money to fund a lavish lifestyle, it stops being personal. It becomes a matter of profound public interest." She pressed play. Richard's voice filled the office, smooth and confident, captured by a bugged briefcase belonging to one of his clients who had decided to cooperate. He was explaining, in condescending detail, how to circumvent transparency requirements in municipal contracts by burying costs in convoluted subclauses. "The city council is a circus," his recorded voice sneered. "You just have to know which clowns to pay." The look on David's face had shifted from skepticism to awe and then to pure, unadulterated journalistic glee. "My God, Camilla," he'd breathed, leaning back in his chair. "This is enough to bring down half of City Hall." But Richard, blissfully unaware, still saw her as the insecure woman who had begged him not to leave. This perception was his greatest vulnerability. 2 days after the invitation arrived, a message popped up on her phone, a confirmation of his unwavering, self-destructive arrogance. "Camilla, I hope you understand the invitation was just a gesture of civility." Madison insisted. She thought it would be the elegant thing to do. "That said, I do hope you won't show up dressed inappropriately. You know how demanding that environment can be." She screenshotted the message instantly. It was perfect. The condescending tone, the casual cruelty, was a piece of character evidence she could use later. A perfect illustration of the man behind the carefully constructed facade. Her reply was a model of restraint, a silken thread pulled taut. "You for your concern, Richard. Rest assured, I will be dressed entirely appropriately for the occasion." What he couldn't know was that her definition of appropriately dressed now included a state-of-the-art digital audio recorder disguised as a diamond brooch, a flash drive loaded with 2 years of research tucked into a hidden pocket of her clutch, and an escort who would serve as a powerful, living reminder to the entire party of exactly who Camila Santos had become. As she typed, her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on her desk. It was of her a year prior, accepting the National Investigative Journalism Award from the hands of the Minister of Justice himself. Next to the photo was a business card, crisp and formal. Alexander Costa, federal prosecutor, specializing in crimes against the public administration. They had met during a joint investigation into a money laundering scheme, and the connection between them had been immediate, a spark of mutual respect that had quickly deepened into something more. Alexander was not just a professional contact. He was the kind of man whose quiet confidence filled a room, whose penetrating gaze seemed to peel back layers of deception without effort. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and he had become her partner, not just in this investigation, but in her life. Richard wanted a spectacle. Oh, she would give him a spectacle of biblical proportions, but the protagonist of this drama would not be the blushing bride. Every arrogant text, every condescending piece of advice about her suitability for his world, only served to stoke the controlled fire of her resolve. Richard had spent years trying to make her feel small in a world he believed was his by birthright. Now, as she arranged the final pieces of evidence, the weapons that would annihilate not only his reputation but his freedom, one thing was certain. The man who had tried to teach her about her proper place was about to receive the most instructive lesson of his life, and it would be delivered on his wedding day. Alexander Costa was the antithesis of Richard Thompson. Where Richard was slick and performative, Alexander was possessed of a deep, unshakable stillness. He didn't need to command respect. It was given freely, a natural response to his formidable intellect and unwavering integrity. They had met in the sterile environment of a federal courthouse conference room, poring over documents related to a money laundering case. The chemistry had been instantaneous, a silent acknowledgement of two minds that operated on the same wavelength. Their professional collaboration on the Richard Thompson case had blurred into a personal relationship, built over late nights in her apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and mountains of legal documents. It was Alexander who had helped her shape the raw data of her investigation into an ironclad legal case. "Camila, are you absolutely sure you want to see this through to the end?" He had asked her one night, 3 weeks before the wedding. Invitation arrived. They were in his spacious, minimalist apartment overlooking the city. The files spread across his dining table between forgotten plates and half-empty glasses of wine. His expression was serious, his dark eyes searching hers. "Richard Thompson has powerful friends. His new father-in-law is Judge Clark. For God's sake, if we make one misstep, he could destroy your career. He'll paint you as a bitter, vengeful ex—" She had met his gaze without flinching, a small, confident smile playing on her lips, the smile he had come to know so well. "Alexander, my career has been attacked by lesser men. I survived," she said softly, reaching across the table to place her hand over his. "Besides, he won't see it coming. He still thinks I'm the woman he left. And this time, I have you by my side." The investigation had been a painstaking two-front war. While Camila worked her sources, Alexander navigated the legal system, obtaining the necessary warrants and subpoenas to follow the money trail. Together they had uncovered a scheme more audacious than they had initially imagined. Richard didn't just rig bids, he had created a self-sustaining ecosystem of corruption. He would recommend friendly construction companies for municipal projects. Those companies, in turn, would inflate their costs, billing the city for millions in phantom services and materials. A significant percentage of that overcharge would then be funneled back, through a dizzying network of offshore accounts and legal partnerships, into accounts controlled by Richard Thompson. Uncovering the scheme was one thing, proving it beyond a reasonable doubt was another. Richard's money could buy the best defense team in the country. "We need the Holy Trinity," Alexander had explained during one of their marathon work sessions, his voice low and intense as he mapped out the flow of money on a whiteboard. "We need the bank records showing the transfers. We need communications, emails, texts, recordings that demonstrate criminal intent. And we need at least 3 independent sources from inside the operation to corroborate the pattern." They had found their first source in Paula Mendez, a timid, middle-aged secretary in the city's procurement department. Paula was David Mendez's cousin, and she had reached out to him in desperation, terrified but morally unable to remain silent any longer. Camilla had met her in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, far from the watchful eyes of City Hall. The companies that win the contracts when Dr. Thompson is involved, they're always the same, Paula had whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. They materialize out of thin air, win multi-million-dollar contracts for services they barely perform, and then vanish. But the money, it always seems to end up in the same financial orbit. Paula was their Rosetta Stone. She didn't just have suspicions. She had documents. She had secretly photocopied payment schedules, contract amendments, and, most damningly, printouts of WhatsApp conversations from an internal City Hall group. In those chats, employees openly discussed the special protection certain companies received. In one conversation, a superior warned a junior employee to stop asking questions about a particular invoice. The message from the department head was chillingly clear. Dr. Thompson has made it clear that some cases are sensitive and must be treated with absolute discretion. Anyone who asks unnecessary questions can start looking for another job. With Paula's evidence as a foundation, Alexander had secured a court order from a judge in a different district to avoid any conflict with Richard's future father-in-law. Investigate the bank accounts of the companies involved. The picture that emerged was staggering. In just under 3 years, Richard had embezzled over $2 million in public money. But as Alexander dug deeper, he found the final, perfect, poetic piece of the puzzle. He called her late one night, his voice crackling with a tense, triumphant energy. "Cammy," he said, the nickname he only used when he was truly excited, "I just found something that's going to make this wedding unforgettable." He's not just celebrating his new life with Madison, he's celebrating it with taxpayer money. Alexander had traced the payments for the wedding, the Oakwood Grand Country Club, the celebrity florist, the couture wedding dress, the 10-tier cake. It was all being paid for, directly and indirectly, by funds siphoned from an offshore account that was fed by the bid-rigging scheme. The party, a spectacle designed to cost over $100,000, was literally being funded by money stolen from the public coffers. He paid for Madison's dress with money that was allocated for a new municipal daycare center. Alexander told her, his voice tight with disbelief and disgust. He's throwing a party with money that should be funding schools and hospitals. In that moment, Camilla's plan shifted. It was no longer enough to simply show up and outshine the bride. It was no longer enough to be a silent, elegant rebuke to his cruelty. She had the opportunity to turn his ultimate triumph into the public stage for his destruction. Richard's wedding wasn't just the setting for her revenge, it was a crime scene. While Richard continued his campaign of petty psychological warfare, via text, Madison suggested you might prefer a table near the back, by the service entrance. It would be more discreet, considering the circumstances. Camilla was coordinating the final details of an operation that had grown to include not only her and Alexander, but a hand-picked team of trusted federal investigators, a few fellow journalists from national outlets who owed her favors, and representatives from the Department of Justice, all waiting for her signal. The irony was so thick she could taste it. The man who had spent years obsessing over her inadequacy for certain environments was about to discover that the most exclusive environment of Ola Federal Penitentiary has rules that neither stolen money nor inherited arrogance can break. For a fleeting moment, as she surveyed the files, the recordings, the court orders laid out across her living room floor, she felt the immense weight of what she was about to do. This was not just a story anymore. This was the complete and utter dismantling of a human being. But anyone who has ever stared into the abyss of true injustice knows that it requires a terrible courage. Precisely when silence and retreat would be so much easier, Richard had built his kingdom on lies and theft, and she, the queen he had banished, was about to burn it to the ground. The black Rolls-Royce Ghost glided to a silent stop before the imposing, ivy-draped entrance of the Oakwood Grand Country Club. The air was thick with the scent of manilla, heady perfume of cut grass, expensive floral arrangements, and the faint, sweet smell of champagne. As Alexander, impeccable in a custom-tailored Italian tuxedo, emerged from the driver's side, a hush fell over the cluster of guests lingering on the grand stone portico. Conversations faltered, cigars paused mid-air, and all eyes turned as he walked around the gleaming vehicle to open the passenger door. The woman who emerged was not a ghost. She was a supernova. Camilla was poured into a gown of shimmering liquid gold, a couture creation that hugged every curve of the body she had worked so hard to reclaim. It was audacious, magnificent, and utterly unapologetic. Diamonds glittered at her ears and throat, catching the late afternoon sun and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Her hair was styled in elegant, sweeping waves that framed a face radiant with a terrifying, serene confidence. She did not look like a scorned ex-wife invited out of pity. She looked like a queen who had arrived to survey her domain. "My God," a woman whispered, her voice carrying on the still air. "Is that Camila Santos?" Alexander offered her his arm, his hand resting possessively in the small of her back. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, ready to give them a show. He murmured, his voice a low rumble of amusement and anticipation. Richard wanted it to be instructive. She whispered back, a dangerous smile touching her lips. "I'm here to educate." They ascended the stone steps as if they owned them, a magnetic, unified force of power and beauty. The whispers followed them, a rippling wave of shock and speculation. They were a vision so potent, so unexpected, that it immediately eclipsed the arrival of the bride and groom. Richard was inside, standing at the entrance to the main ballroom, a champagne flute in his hand, laughing at something his new father-in-law, the Honorable Judge Clark, had said. He was at the zenith of his life, the center of his universe, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who has won at everything. He noticed a sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the ambient chatter had dipped and then surged with a new, urgent energy. He turned casually, a king surveying his court, expecting to see a late-arriving senator or a local celebrity, and then he saw her. The blood drained from his face with such startling speed that for a moment he looked grey. The champagne flute trembled in his hand, a tiny telltale tremor that betrayed the seismic shock running through him. "It can't be," he breathed, the words a faint puff of air. "Madison, a vision in a $15,000 Vera Wong gown paid for, ironically with funds embezzled from the budget for a public daycare center," followed his petrified gaze. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The woman gliding towards them, radiating an almost celestial aura of confidence, was a creature from another world. She was nothing like the dowdy, insecure, inappropriate woman Richard had described in his casual dismissals of his first marriage. "Richard, who is that?" she asked, her voice laced with a sudden, sharp insecurity, though a cold dread was already telling her the answer. "Camila," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "My ex-wife." The world seemed to slow as Camila and Alexander came to a stop before them. The string quartet, sensing a shift in the drama, faltered for a beat before resuming their polite music. "Good afternoon, Richard," Camila said, her voice like honey poured over razor blades. It was smooth, sweet, and promised a world of pain. She turned her brilliant smile on the bride. "Madison, you look absolutely stunning. Congratulations, on your special day." Before either of them could formulate a reply, Alexander extended a hand, his movements fluid and assured. "Alexander Costa," he said, his gaze level and deeply unnerving. He shook Richard's limp, clammy hand. "Federal prosecutor, specializing in financial crimes. It's a pleasure to finally meet you both." Richard choked on a mouthful of champagne, the liquid fizzing unpleasantly in his throat. "Federal and prosecutor." The two words slammed into his brain, short-circuiting every thought. He looked from Alexander's implacable face to Camila's serene smile, and the first tendrils of pure animal panic began to snake around his heart. "Oh, yes," Alexander continued, his own smile utterly devoid of warmth. "Camila and I have been working very closely together on an investigation. She's become one of the most respected journalists in the nation when it comes to exposing, well, corruption in public contracts. A true talent." Richard's face was now a mask of waxy horror. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The dominoes were not just falling in his mind, they were crashing down. A cascade of horrifying realizations, the odd questions from city clerks, the unexpected audit notices, the strange feeling he'd had for months of being watched. It all led here, to this moment, to her. "Actually," Camila said, her voice cutting through his spiraling panic, "I brought you a wedding gift, a very special one. I thought, since today is all about making memories, you might like to see some." She reached into her small, elegant clutch and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. Madison, still reeling but trying desperately to cling to the shreds of her social composure, forced a tight smile. "How very kind of you, Camila. You really shouldn't have." "Oh, but I insisted," Camila purred, her eyes locking onto Richard's. She opened the envelope and, with the flair of a magician, produced a series of photographs printed on high-gloss paper. "These are just a few records of the most memorable moments from your recent legal career. A little something for your wedding album." She fanned them out like a winning poker hand. The first photo was a crystal clear shot, taken with a powerful telephoto lens, of Richard entering a discreet, expensive restaurant. With him were 3 other men, their faces clearly identifiable. The caption at the bottom read, Richard Thompson, meeting with the CEOs of Millennium Construction, Solar Incorporated, and Primus Edificos. Date, May 12, 2 days prior to the bid submission for the new municipal hospital contract. Richard lunged a desperate, clumsy attempt to snatch the photos from her hand, but Camila was quicker, pulling them back with a dancer's grace. Richard, let's not rush. The best stories unfold in sequence. She revealed the second photo. It showed Richard in the restaurant's dimly lit parking lot, receiving a thick manila envelope from one of the same businessmen. The third photo was the devastating finale, a shot through his own BMW's passenger window, capturing the exact moment he was inside, counting stacks of $100 bills, his face illuminated by the car's interior light. Camila, what in God's name are you doing? Richard hissed, his voice a ragged whisper of pure terror. Just sharing some fond memories. She replied sweetly, her eyes glittering. After all, these photos help document exactly how you managed to pay for this wonderful, wonderful party. Madison, her face a pale canvas of confusion and dread, took one of the photos with a trembling hand. Richard, what is she talking about? What is this? It was then that Camila produced her smartphone. With a tap of her thumb, an audio file began to play. The sound was crisp, clear, and amplified just enough for those in the immediate vicinity to hear Richard's voice, unmistakable, arrogant, and selfish, should fill the air. The important thing, his recorded voice said, is that the right companies win the right contracts. If a few processes need to be adjusted to ensure that outcome, well, that's just the cost of doing business in this town. The blood had not just drained from Richard's face, it had been vacuumed out. He looked wildly around, his eyes darting from face to face, realizing with dawning horror that the nearby guests, his partners, his friends, Madison's family, had fallen silent. They were all watching, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to rapt attention. This was no longer a private confrontation. It was a public execution. Where did you get that? He demanded, his voice cracking, devolving from a whisper to a desperate squeak. Paula Mendez from the city's procurement department. She turned out to be a very brave woman, Camila explained, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. She meticulously documented every one of your special instructions, on which companies should receive preferential treatment. She's a remarkable record keeper. Alexander stepped forward then, his presence radiating an official, unassailable authority. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and produced a slim leather folder. Actually, Richard, this seems like an appropriate time to inform you that a federal investigation into municipal bidding fraud was officially opened this morning, and, funnily enough, your name appears on every single one of the questionable contracts we've examined from the past 3 years. Madison dropped the photographs. They scattered across the polished marble floor like fallen leaves. Her hands flew to her mouth, a gesture of pure, unadulterated horror. Richard, she whispered, her eyes wide and pleading, tell me this isn't true. Of course it's not true, he exploded, but the denial came out high-pitched and weak, the blustering of a cornered animal. It's a lie. She's a bitter ex-wife. These photos could be fake. The recordings, they could be edited. Camila's smile was a thing of terrifying beauty. She produced a slim tablet from her clutch, its screen glowing to life. I'm so glad you brought up the possibility of fabrication, Richard, because edited documents are so unprofessional, which is why I brought the original bank statements for the offshore accounts linked to your network of shell companies. She angled the tablet so both Richard and Madison could see the detailed spreadsheet, rows and columns of numbers, dates, and transfers. A final, highlighted tally at the bottom read, $2,347,500, $2.3 million, Camila said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. Embezzled in under 3 years. Madison, she said, her voice softening with mock sympathy as she turned to the bride. That's significantly more than he claimed on his tax returns, isn't it? Madison stared at the screen, her fairy tale wedding dissolving into a nightmarish ledger of crime. Richard, that's more than you said you earned in a decade. And here, Camila continued, her finger sliding across the screen to a new page, is my personal favorite part. The specific disbursements for this party. The catering, the band, the venue rental, the $10,000 worth of flowers, all paid for directly from accounts funded by money that was supposed to build public schools and renovate city hospitals. Richard's world was not just collapsing, it was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, live and in front of an audience of 150 of the city's most influential people. Several journalists, discreetly invited by Alexander under the guise of covering a high society wedding, were now openly recording on their phones. Camilla's final move was delivered with the precision of a surgeon. She looked directly at Madison, her expression one of profound, pitying sincerity. "Madison, did you know that the beautiful dress you're wearing was purchased with funds allocated for the construction of a daycare center in the city's poorest suburb? There are 23 children who have no place to go, no early childhood education, because Richard felt it was more important to impress his wedding guests." That was the final blow. Madison began to cry, not the delicate happy tears of a bride, but the wrenching, ugly sobs of absolute horror and betrayal. "Richard," she choked out, "tell me it's a lie. Tell me now." He looked from his shattered bride to his avenging angel of an ex-wife, to the federal prosecutor standing like a sentinel beside her, to the sea of shocked and judgmental faces that had formed a circle around them. His mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. And then, the flashes started. The professional photographers, sensing the story of a lifetime, abandoned their posed shots of wedding guests and turned their lenses on. The central drama, the pop-up of their strobes, was like gunfire, each flash searing the image of Richard's downfall into the collective memory of the city. "Please," he finally managed to whisper, his eyes pleading with Camilla. "Please, don't do this here. Not today." Camilla tilted her head, her expression a perfect mask of false compassion. "Oh, Richard, do you remember when you told me it would be an instructive day? You were right. I've just learned that some environments built on honesty, and the rule of law have standards that even stolen money can't buy you into." Alexander closed his leather folder with a soft final snap. "Richard Thompson," he said, his voice now formal and cold, "you have the right to remain silent. I would strongly advise you to exercise it. I must also inform you that a team of federal agents is currently on its way to execute search and seizure warrants at your home and your office." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a single, sharp sound. Madison, with a guttural cry of rage, ripped the massive diamond ring from her finger and hurled it to the marble floor. It bounced with a series of metallic clinks, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall like a judge's gavel dot as the guests erupted into a maelstrom of frantic murmurs and the cameras continued to flash. One undeniable truth crystallized in the minds of everyone present: this wedding would be remembered forever, but not for its elegance or romance. And at the heart of the perfectly orchestrated devastation stood Camila Santos, serene and resplendent in her golden gown, a queen who had not merely reclaimed her kingdom, but had burned her usurpers to the ground using the most powerful weapon of all, the truth, served cold, at the perfect time and in the perfect place. The image that graced the front page of every newspaper the next morning was brutally iconic: Richard Thompson, his $3,000 tuxedo rumpled, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and panic, being led away in handcuffs by stone-faced federal agents. In the background, the opulent floral archways of his wedding celebration framed his disgrace like a funeral wreath. Madison had vanished 20 minutes after the public implosion, leaving her blood-stained wedding gown the fabric torn where she had ripped off the diamond necklace. Richard had brought her in a heap on the floor of the bridal suite. Her parents, the judge and his society wife, were seen making a hasty, undignified exit through a kitchen service door, their faces pale with fury and humiliation. The headline, splashed in bold 72-point font, was written by David Mendez himself. "The wedding crasher, jilted wife, exposes ex-husband's multi-million-dollar corruption scheme at the altar." 6 months later, Camila stood in the panoramic corner office of her newly launched firm, Santos Crisis Communications and Investigative Consulting. The office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she had a clear view of the building where Richard's old law firm, Sterling Croft and Lowell, was located. They had fired him the day after the wedding and issued a public statement condemning his abhorrent and criminal behavior. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw Alexander's name on the screen. "Good news or bad news?" she asked, her voice light and playful. "Depends on your perspective," he replied, a warm laugh in his voice. "The final verdict on the asset forfeiture just came in. Richard lost everything: the house, the cars, the investment accounts. The government seized it all to pay back the city. Madison got the marriage annulled on grounds of fraud, And the cherry on top, she's suing him for emotional distress and punitive damages. Camila laughed, a genuine, happy sound. Poetic justice, she murmured, signing her name with a flourish to a lucrative contract with an international media conglomerate that wanted to turn her investigation into a documentary series. Her firm had become a national phenomenon. The story of the wedding had gone viral, turning her into a symbol of righteous fury and female empowerment. Corporations, terrified of their own internal corruption being exposed so publicly, now hired her to find their skeletons before someone else did. She was building a reputation not just for exposing wrongdoing, but for helping companies build new foundations based on radical transparency. Paula Mendez, the courageous secretary who had risked everything, was now the head of the city's new Office of Ethics and Governmental Transparency, a position created in the wake of the scandal. At her inauguration ceremony, she had tearfully thanked a woman of incredible courage who proved that the truth, served at the right moment, is more powerful than any political connection or old boys club. David, her former editor, had left the newspaper to become the director of journalism for her company. Cammy, he'd said to her during a meeting just the week before. I remember when you walked into my office 3 years ago, a ghost of a person, completely devastated by that divorce. Now look at you. You're not just reporting the news, you're changing the whole damn industry. On the low-slung coffee table in her office, framed in elegant, minimalist gold, was the front page from the day after the wedding. The photo showed her and Alexander leaving the country club hand in hand, she, radiant and triumphant in her golden gown. He, elegant and protective in his tuxedo. In the background, out of focus but unmistakable, was the pathetic figure of Richard being guided into the back of an unmarked federal car. Richard himself was serving the second year of an 8-year sentence in a medium-security federal prison. He had lost not only his freedom and his fortune but the one thing he valued above all else, his social relevance. He had become a ghost, his name a byword for arrogance and disgrace. Former colleagues pretended not to know him. The Oakwood Grand had scrubbed all mention of his wedding from their records. He had ceased to exist in the world he had fought so hard to conquer. One Friday afternoon, as Camila was reviewing a proposal for a new investigation, her assistant buzzed her. "There's a call for you. It's Richard Thompson." Camila paused, surprised. She hadn't heard from him since his sentencing. A flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps a detached, clinical curiosity made her take the call. "This is Camila." The voice on the other end was a broken, hollowed-out version of the one she remembered. It was thin, reedy, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Camila, it's Richard. I know I have no right to call you, but I just needed you to know that." "Richard," she interrupted, her voice calm and even devoid of malice. "I sincerely hope you are using your time to reflect on the lives you damaged with your greed. I have absolutely nothing to discuss with you." "Please," he begged, and the sound was pathetic. "Just 1 minute. I know I deserved it. All of it. But I never imagined that I had become so successful." Camila finished for him, her voice cool and clear. "It's funny, isn't it? The people who try to diminish you are always the most shocked when they discover the true scale of your capabilities." She hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. There was no anger left in her, no satisfying sting of victory, only the quiet, profound peace of a battle long since won. She had moved on. He was irrelevant. That night, she and Alexander were having dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant, the same place where they had first planned the final stages of the wedding day operation. He raised his glass of Barolo, his eyes sparkling. "In the candlelight, a toast," he said, his voice low and intimate. "To the woman who proved that the best revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you." Camila smiled, touching her glass to his. No, he confirmed. "It's building a life so magnificent that they become a forgotten footnote in your biography." She took a sip of the rich, dark wine, the taste of victory and a future she had built with her own 2 hands. The lesson Richard had inadvertently taught her was the one she now shared in lectures and keynote speeches around the world. It was simple, but revolutionary. When someone tries to make you feel small, your response should not be to shrink to fit their narrow definition of you, nor to lash out in kind. The most powerful response is to grow so vast, so brilliant, so undeniably successful that their smallness is exposed by the sheer, blinding light of your own. Richard Thompson had invited her to his wedding to humiliate her. Instead, he had handed her the perfect stage upon which to announce to the world, and to herself, exactly who she was. Sometimes, Our greatest enemies do us the great and unintended favor of forcing us to discover the true measure of our own power.